refuse my bajol?
Refuse your what?
Range 95 meters. Projectile mass 89 kilograms. Trust me. Mission complete.
Gosh, you know, we could spend all this time designing all these robots, we can't figure out a decent way to record someone's voice. I mean, come on. Ugh. Anyways, have you ever asked yourself why we really like seeing robots fight? I mean, aside from the ridiculousness of it, why is it that of all the things that could become a sci-fi trope, it'd have to be robots? Who's to say the future of warfare isn't something else, like giant super monsters or impromptu games of basketball? No, says everyone without a sense of humor, it must be robots.
Hold on! It's my leg! It's my leg again! It's my fucking...
Video games are even more stringent. Your game is vaguely futuristic, there will be a robot at some point. Might not even need to be futuristic at all. They'll be in there, I promise. But I'd argue that they're a little more complicated than that. Instead, I'd say robots in games is yet another expression for the industry's endless lust to run more ideas into the ground. You've seen it with everything. You got your kitty horror.
Was that the bite of 87?
Escort missions turned into entire games. That one time in 2012 and 2013 when every game had a bow in it, etc, etc. Making your stuff about robots or mechs is to some extent an excuse to make your game the way you want to make it. But it's not always that simple. Though I guess I should clarify. When I say robot, I can mean a lot of things, can't I? Do I mean actual robots? Do I mean droids or androids? Or do I mean mechs with people in them? To me, it doesn't really matter, just that I have an excuse to show them off. Part of that divide is between East and West, mind you, and I don't mean with an iron curtain. When I say mech, an American in between bites of his Big Mac probably imagines... But I say the same thing to Tojo from Japan and suddenly... Oh gosh. I think in the end we can agree that if you see it and you could reasonably say, that's a robot, then it's good enough. Battle mechs, they count. Armored cores, they count. Gundams, when they decide to actually make games out of them, they count. Titans, yep. Metal Gears, of course they do. Do you even need to ask? The question is, does playing as a robot actually make a difference? And the answer is obviously yes. Let's start with a baseline. Your average, typical super fighting robot. Many of the poor, sweet, innocent gamers amongst you may not have ever actually heard of Supreme Commander, but it's an older strategy game about commanding big armies of troops and sending them into a meat grinder until one side loses. Jay, just like war in real life. In the far future, humanity is stuck in a giant war that will never end, with three factions of varying moral ambiguity duking it out for no discernible reason. And of course it has some super fighting robots, since it's the far future. How could you not have them? Now usually they're either these small baby ones, or more likely they're massive fighting behemoths, the titular experimental units, which everyone actually likes. Then there's you in your ACU, or Armored Combat Unit? I think that's right. It's a big robot that builds instead of fights. Remember, that's you in there. Don't get smoked or take risks that put you in danger, because if you do, you'll be met with an Oppenheimer surprise. You are technically playing as a robot, just you're ironically not the focus here. Instead, the implication is that ACUs and the commanders in them are basically the next technological step for humanity's butt-kicking fiascos. An ACU isn't just a robot, it's a mobile army construction machine! It can build an entire invasion force almost from scratch, and can manage that army with an efficiency a modern general can only dream of. It plays to something really important about futurism and sci-fi aesthetics. And that's that robots just look more advanced than anything else, which is entirely out of our control. I suppose you could have made the ACU be a tank or a car or something, but would that really communicate the gravity of the invention? If I drove a van onto the battlefield and it shot out a laser that built my army for me, you'd probably go, well, that's just silly. And you'd be right.
James, can I borrow your van?
What would communicate how important the ACU is? Make it something that the ordinary person will simply never meaningfully experience in their lives, but which could reasonably become a part of later generations. A super fighting robot. The same principle applies to plenty of other science fiction settings. For example, you ever wonder why the Enterprise in Star Trek has a raised saucer as a part of the ship's design? Aside from just looking nice, it's most clearly meant to emulate an actual flying saucer, Little Green Men style. That look of a ship with those proportions is outlandish and strange, yet obviously advanced given its extraterrestrial association. They made it like that because you would instantly recognize that it was advanced, something to become engrossed in by the possibility of what it could achieve. And it's the same thing with super fighting robots. Not to say that Supreme Commander is high art, mind you. The robots in the game exist mostly for one reason, that they are meaningfully futuristic enough to make an appearance, but they're not exactly the focus. There are plenty of other units in the game, from tanks and aircraft to naval units. They aren't the focus, simply a symptom of its genre in general, which isn't to knock it. It's some of the best strategy gameplay ever, but we really need to find something that's robot-centric if we want to get into it. Battletech started as a tabletop game about guys who pilot mechs in the far future for the purposes of, you guessed it, waging intergalactic war for no reason. It was a wholly strategic affair. I hope you like big number sheets for your robots. Over time, though, they got turned into video games, most notably MechWarrior, where you, yes you, get the opportunity to pilot these titans of the battlefield. The impetus then for making the game, aside from turning Battletech into something cool, is to give you the badass feeling of piloting a mech, and they certainly do that. Battletech mechs are notable for a few reasons. First, battle mechs, though they come in various sizes and weight classes, are fairly massive and occasionally lumbering war machines, which stomp across the battlefield, destroying most everything in their wake. Side note, you'll notice most of the time in these examples here that the mech is the ultimate in combat power, because they can walk around and stuff. But at the same time, Battletech takes it a step further, by placing you into the seat of these machines with both their power and limitations in mind. Now, all games place limitations on the player, their genre and general context being what defines those limits. You can't fly around like a plane in a first-person shooter, and you can't fistfight other pilots in a flying game. When you add robots, whether piloted or commanded, you suddenly have the limits of what those things bring to the table. For MechWarrior, your mech is you by extension. You are now the lumbering giant. You can't just get out of the damn thing, that would defeat the point. At the same time, the power you feel of being in a mech is what draws people to it. They allow the player to express themselves through outrageous degrees of destruction on a scale your opponents usually can't match. You know, there are tanks and infantry in Battletech, and guess what? You don't want to be them. They are literally cannon fodder. They exist because some bureaucrat made a spreadsheet which calculated that it would be worth the cost of losing several hundred tanks and the crews therein if it slightly inconvenienced the enemy's mech lance, and so that's exactly what they did. Which, of course, is the point. Being in a mech is powerful. It's exciting. It's a giant, stupid robot smashing houses for fun. I mean, what's not to like? That's only part of Battletech's appeal, though. The mechs themselves are just as important in a setting and expressive context. When you think super fighting robot, you might jump to the generic robot with a gun. Or maybe something way more fun like a RoboCop. In Battletech, though, the creators of the setting took the idea very seriously. More serious than every other example in this video, I'd say. They asked, if you were really going to make a giant fighting robot, why would it be better than a conventional vehicle? And how would you actually design one? Their answers were simple. Mechs inherently bring more value to the battlefield because they combine mobility with firepower and survivability. And yet they still fall into easily definable roles or categories, just like weapon systems in real life. This is important because A, it's realistic, and B, it gives a greater degree of information to a player as to what they may actually enjoy about a particular mech. You ever play a shooter and you look at all the guns and say, man, there's so many, I bet they all play different, and then they don't? Shooters can be like that. It's hard to make a gun feel different from another when often many of them in reality just do the same thing. They sling lead. Mechs though? Well, the sky's the limit when it comes to designs. You can do whatever you want. And so they did. There are light mechs for scouting and hit and run attacks, mechs with close-range missile barrages that act like a robot equivalent of a shotgun, mechs that split the difference, carrying conventional ballistic weapons, lasers, and missiles for a variety of tasks, mechs which act as mobile missile or artillery platforms, mechs that exist to fight other mechs in a straight-up brawl, mechs with silly melee weapons for close combat, mechs that just unload waves of laser attacks, mechs that do just about everything. They're all so different that it's impossible for a player not to engage with at least one of them, whether it's because of their playstyle or just the way they look. It's diverse in the best way possible, where everything is meaningfully different and speaks to the individual in a very personal way. My favorite mech is the Highlander. It's hard to kill, but capable of taking on most problems it runs into, within reason, of course. And it doesn't stop there, because these mechs aren't just treated like machines, they're treated like real weapon systems in terms of lore or background. They have different models and production runs, some are more customizable than others. They usually need field refits because parts are scarce. Don't underestimate the background setting when it comes to these things. There's something very strange about them when you start thinking back to where they even come from. Someone built that mech on some far-off planet, probably hundreds of years ago. It took a team of engineers weeks or months to put it together in a massive factory, before it was shipped off to a regiment where some greenhorn pilot took its controls for the first time. In Battletech, mechs have a tendency to outlive their pilots, so you can imagine the thing changing hands several times, being smashed up or even destroyed, before having its own little Lazarus moment in a repair bay. It's been traveling millions and billions of miles to make it to this backwater of a planet to fight you, and now it's here. And you blast it into little pieces with your autocannon. You just destroyed entire history after that. And it's a powerful feeling. That's the point of a battle mech. Where Supreme Commander's robots exist for the aesthetic and the feeling, Battletech's mechs exist for that, as well as the sheer power of what such an invention brings to a setting. If there's one thing we know about many of our scientific advancements, one thing that is often universal, is that they're powerful, more powerful than anything that came before. We all want our newest hardware to be powerful, whether it's a car, a war machine, or a PC. It's a sign of superiority which we unintentionally strive for. It'd be nice if we felt we were better than someone or something else, as shitty as that might be to admit, and when you're in a mech, that's exactly the experience you get. You literally tower over your opposition. Mechs are the kings of the battlefield and the end-all be-all of what conventional combat can bring to bear, and that reflects both on the player as well as the characters of the setting. You'll notice, if you're not too much into any one side of Battletech's myriad conflicts, that everyone's just a bunch of assholes. That's definitely the point. The world of Battletech is dominated by mech pilots who serve the central hierarchies of their respective nations or factions, most of which are organized as either monarchies, dictatorships, or theocracies who, surprise surprise, are filled with assholes. And that's exactly what you would expect from such massive nations who have to live with long travel times between planets. The battle mech just compounds that problem. You put your top assholes in your top mechs to make sure the other guy's assholes aren't good enough to blow up enough of your serfs, so you could spend another day lording it over your fellow man. That's why the most heroic people in the setting are often mercenaries, because at least they fight for cash money. They put their necks on the lines for everyone else's sake, and it's what makes you look cool when you're playing as them. Remember, your mech made that same journey as the guy I smoked. You have to be privy to that fact, sure, even if it's ancient tech and isn't even that advanced now. It's still the most engaging thing you can be a part of in the far-off battlefields of the inner sphere. As long as you have your super fighting robot, your battle mech, you can do anything, no matter what the Great Houses or Comstar or the clans want to say about it. When you have a mech, you have the one thing that makes a difference. You have some power. There's something special about mechs in a certain way. You can analyze just about anything the way I did before, but objects in particular, like weapons, are the most fascinating. The bullet that took the life of Franz Ferdinand was probably made in some factory without a care for who it might be used against. It's a fun little thing to think about. The same could be said for my Highlander and every other piece of machinery on the battlefield of the far future. But of course that's us projecting onto the objects themselves. They're not actually alive. Mechs aren't even really robots in a stricter sense. Instead, there are other, more campy examples of super fighting robots that we can turn to. Titanfall is absolutely a product of its time. When the online FPS had finally become too much to bear for everyone, Respawn gladly graced us with an even worse shooter that introduced everyone to the movement shooter genre, and thus ruined it for a decade. That's because Titanfall was just a weird marriage of stuff like Quake or Unreal with COD, united by one actually kinda cool gimmick: super fighting robots. Titans, more specifically, which fall from the sky for you to pilot and fight other guys with. I am now done talking about the first game because it's a snooze fest. Let's talk about the actual good Titanfall game. Titanfall 2 is a much better Titanfall with a single-player campaign and much more varied and engaging multiplayer. What's kinda incredible about it is that the Titans almost seem incidental unless you've played it, but in reality they actually make the entire game work. In the first game they were just a gimmick, that's why they were added. There's nothing interesting about them beyond that. In the second game, though, they serve the role of balancing out multiplayer matches by presenting players with larger opponents to fight within the confines of the map, which otherwise would just be mediocre Twitch shooter arenas. They're also just a fun idea to mix the fast-paced shooting with slower, more armored combat that's more tactical and heavily influenced by a particular Titan's playstyle. What's most shocking, however, is that the single player, something that was entirely missing in the original, ended up being not just a good part of the game, but maybe the best part of it. It gave the Titans a much more interesting role in the narrative, showing off more about how they actually work in the setting, while also establishing themselves as more than a gimmick or a mostly enjoyable gameplay element. The Titans are actually robots. They have AIs that govern what they can do. They just also happen to be pilotable by their pilots. What's more, Titanfall 2 actually showed off what that pairing of hyper-agile pilot and unstoppable robot actually does in a practical sense. The two are extremely adaptable and capable of tackling complex problems that your average super soldier or mech warrior would be incapable of handling. In Titanfall, super fighting robots are the norm because they're perfect for the small-scale frontier conflicts of the setting. They're extremely efficient where other systems wouldn't be. Efficiency is yet another sci-fi trope, one that has, of course, leaked into reality even more than we realize. You probably figured it out at some point, that you as a pilot and you and your Titan are outrageously effective compared to the loser infantry and robots you run into both in campaign and multiplayer. Part of that is because you're playing a video game, obviously. At the same time, the game is about you as some wall-running commando backed up by a super fighting robot in this future dominated by professional soldiers who so thoroughly outclass their opponents that it makes perfect sense, at least a little bit. You can be selectively destructive with your Titan, while at the same time retaining the ability for you or your robot to be deployed anywhere via the proverbial Titanfall. The abilities of a pilot to maneuver so much is perfect for a far-flung frontier space event. All the different locales and obstacles which would otherwise impede a normal soldier or robot are mostly circumvented by their exceptional mobility. It's the sort of speculative fiction that really makes sense, that most sci-fi does try to play to. In terms of gameplay, the Titans are meant to slow down the normal gameplay loop of jumping and shooting. It's not as slow or lumbering as a Battletech mech, but it's also not like a Gundam or something. It's somewhere in the middle. They're all designed to be humanoid in shape, which is kind of funny since you pilot it in first person, so you're still technically playing an FPS instead of a robot game. The Titans are intentionally animated to move much more like a person, a giant metal person mind you, but still. A part of me wonders if Titanfall would just be better off as a straight-up robot game. That's what really draws people to it. Take it out and you effectively just get a bad movement shooter Call of Duty game, or you just literally get Apex Legends. Imagine Apex with Titans. It would instantly be slightly less awful. Thankfully, Titanfall managed to fix its gimmick problem and bring its super fighting robots into their own. With Battletech and Supreme Commander, they were always just a given that they were the focus to varying degrees. Titanfall had to earn that focus by, actually making a good game. But all these titles and settings only apply their bots and the experience they bring to a certain degree. Like, you have a reason to score in your battle bots for one reason or another. If only there was a game where the bot was just the end-all be-all of what the game was about. Armored Core is a series that literally rose from the ashes to be good again. Now, obviously, it's made by the Japs, which means these bots are going to be a lot different. In the West, we like our robots to be big, stupid machines that trundle about committing property damage through user error. It's certainly one way to make a robot, but not something the Japanese are into. No, they like their stuff sleek and cool. Precision engineering type stuff. You see a super fighting robot in Japan, you get something like an Armored Core. Armored Cores aren't just a robot. They're not just a war machine you deploy alongside your other stuff. They're basically all anyone really wants to use to varying degrees of severity. That's because an Armored Core isn't really the robot part of the machine. It's just that little bit on the inside. The Armored Core? ACs don't need to be designed for a particular model like mechs or Titans. They're entirely built on the idea of modularity, which again is very futuristic. If ACUs are sort of just sensible and obligatory, and mechs are designed for power and scale, Titans are designed for efficiency and necessity, then Armored Cores are designed for modularity, being multifaceted. Armored Cores can be taken apart and turned into something totally new to fit the mission, very different compared to the rest. ACs are way faster as a result. Even the slowest ones are intended to go stupid fast. Since they need to be able to have interchangeable parts, they can't actually have lots of intricate armor pieces or complex internals like a mech. So making them tanky is clearly out of the question. They rely on how fast and maneuverable they are to take on whatever they're fighting, whether it be other ACs to giant super weapons. They're capable of ground combat as well as fighting in the air, probably in any other biome you can think of. Now, why do the Japanese prefer their robots to be these smaller, more versatile design? I have two guesses. Number one, in Japan, the earliest iterations of super fighting robots just happened to be made like that, and were further heightened in importance by being repeated in various forms over time, culminating, in the case for games at least, in things like the Armored Core. Or two, the Japanese are crazy alien psychopaths from another dimension, and they just make things to be the opposite of whatever the West does, hence why Japanese games are actually good. I honestly can't tell which is true. Anyways, armored cores are stupid fast. They gotta be to avoid damage. Every other bot here could take some hits, but not these fancy Asian imports. Typical. It's interesting to compare something like an AC to a battle mech in this regard. You know, when I'm in my mech and I encounter another mech and we fight, neither of us really come out the other end of that experience feeling very good. Most mechs slap the hell out of each other when they fight, and you'll never make it through an engagement without at least a few scratches, unless you're real lucky. In an AC, however, you want to move as much as you can to dodge enemy attacks. You actually can avoid a lot of damage through clever maneuvering. It's just difficult. It suits that sleek style that Japanese mechs have, where they're always moving, always dodging and showing off. Another difference between the Western bots and the Japs is the varying context of what the mechs are actually used for. In Supreme Commander, the robots are there because it makes sense. An intergalactic war needs a few battle bots. In Battletech, the entire setting is dominated by mechs, but not specifically the battle mech. There are plenty of mechs which do all sorts of other things. In this instance, the addition of robots is used as a major storytelling element. It's not technically a driving force in the setting, but rather it's just so totally baked into the reality of its world that it becomes inseparable. It's like how in real life we just have stuff like the internet, and it sort of defines a lot of what we do now. It's not because the internet is the end-all be-all of our reality, it's just a major facet of it. Titans were a gimmick turned unique marriage between gameplay styles that just happened to work as a decent story element. The world of Titanfall is barely relevant to the Titans. In fact, if you took them out of the setting, it wouldn't change it that much at all. And yet their presentation is what makes them so memorable, just like all the other bots do. For Armored Core, though, they're solely the excuse to come up with unique, interesting gameplay dynamics, from level traversal to customization and playstyle. It's a unique challenge to present to players where their taste in AC parts will define how well they do in a certain mission or fight. It encourages the player to get engrossed in the world by taking the robots seriously on a mechanical level rather than a narrative or aesthetic level. Not that they don't look great, but the focus is clearly on the mechanics and in-depth systems at work which test you as both a pilot and a designer. This is further supported by the story of most Armored Core games. Remember in the Mech Warrior bit how I said being a merc is sort of the cool thing to do? You're not that bad of a guy if you partake, you're just kinda outside the system. Well, in Armored Core, you can ignore that. You're a merc, and you take contracts from all of the megas. That's right, from the Megacorps to the Megalomaniacs, and maybe even a few Mega Men here or there. Your role is the quiet, calculating killing machine that the ACU pilot makes you out to be. It's sterile or bland, but in an intentional way. They know you're here for the robot, not the goings-on of some far-off planet whose problems are interchangeable with any other rock you could be landing on. You're being paid to be the best super fighting robot there is, as cynical as it sounds, and that's just the way it needs to be. So why would you put super fighting robots in your game? Oh, come on, I just made a video about it. What the hell? Alright, well, aside from just looking cool, they bring with them their own unique tones and aesthetic flourishes based on what they were trying to achieve. You could see this in all of the examples above, where the addition of the mech is almost entirely necessary for the game to function in a way that's actually satisfying. Think about all these games and ask yourself if you could replace their bots with something else, and if that thing would still make sense. Would it be able to recreate the same feeling the player has of playing it if they were swapped for something else? The answer is essentially no, unless you made a lot of changes to everything else. Supreme Commander could do without the ACU, but then what would you replace it with? There's not that much that comes to mind. Battletech and Mech Warrior literally built themselves around their mechs. You can't replace them since they're that central. Titanfall could theoretically do without the Titans, but it would rob the experience of so much, and you'd be totally unable to replace them with something that could be just as effective at juxtaposing the fast shooter aspects with slower vehicle gameplay. And lastly, Armor Cores couldn't be replaced because their original design meets all the gameplay requirements for the style of Japanese action gameplay that it was designed for. The mech is a tool for gameplay in all these situations, and yet by their inclusion they brought with them their own unique experiences, not just because the gameplay was different, but because the feeling of what those bots represented were different as well. Again, look at them like a gun in a video game. Most guns work exactly the same. They don't always define the aesthetic experience as strongly as other factors. But suddenly, compare guns from Call of Duty Modern Warfare to guns from Call of Duty World at War, and suddenly things change wildly. The feeling of using them, of what they were made for in the context of the game, and what they were made for in the context of designing that game. And suddenly, they become much more complicated. You can't avoid this when you put something in your game, and I mean that to apply to literally everything. Everything you put in a game matters. It defines the experience, even if it's something really small. For mechs and robots, they could have easily just been a gimmick. They could have been an addition for the sake of just being an enticing thing, not actually having any interesting applications outside of that. But they never did. It's a facet which constantly sees expansion upon when it's included. It never stagnates like other mechanics or ideas. How many fantasy worlds have you experienced where they're just a fantasy world and that's it? How many driving games are there where the point is you just race and that's it? This is how every idea in a game should be treated. They should be taken seriously, taken to a logical conclusion, which by extension will create an interesting experience. The gameplay might unironically be the least important part. Instead, it's the presentation of it, how it feels to play the game, rather than what you're actually doing. Once developers can recapture this skill consistently, they can expand on anything they put their minds to, anything that the future holds. Whether that be titans, mechs, ACUs, or armored cores, anything in a game can eventually just become a super fighting robot.
Super fighting robot. Mega Man. Super fighting robot. Mega Man.
What a sorry state we're in.
Alright, I didn't have anywhere else to put this. I'm slapping it at the end. So there's this part in the Captain N television show where Cutman from Mega Man shows up. Now, first off, gotta remember, Mega Man and Captain N isn't like Mega Man. He's like a little hobgoblin guy who's really short, and he talks. When he talks, it sounds like he smoked a pack of menthols every day. Anyways, Cutman shows up, except he's not called Cutman. He calls himself Cutsman with an S in the middle. Anyways, he arrives and he has his big line and it goes,
Cutsman's the name, cutting's my game, and I don't mean hair.
and then after he says that, he launches like the pair of scissors at Captain N, and it like flies around and comes back, and that's the only attack he can do. And then after that, he follows it up with just the most incredible like laugh while making scissor things with his fingers, and that's Cutsman.